All right, so we should be good to go. I am Zach Hoddle. I'm the archivist here at the Shenandoah County Library. Um, and I am going to be talking tonight a little bit about African American life here in the county during the 1920s. Um, I know we were all hoping to be able to do this last week, and then the snowstorm hit, and unfortunately, we had to postpone because I couldn't get into the building. Um, but hopefully, we'll have a good audience and a good discussion for tonight. What I am going to do is go ahead and share my screen so that we can see the PowerPoint and get going. Okay, so can everyone see the PowerPoint? Good. All right, and we are going to get started from the beginning. All right, so again, we're talking about Shenandoah County's African American community in the 1920s. If you're watching live on Facebook, or if you want to watch this later, you can follow us on @CountyLib on either Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and be able to catch up with this video. So, you know, I thought a lot about what to do for our Black History Month program this year. And I initially thought, wow, wouldn't it be simple if I just decided to examine life 100 years ago in Shenandoah County, what it was like for our African American communities? Because in the past, we've really focused on certain things like churches or integration of schools, very specific things. So I said, boy, it would be simple maybe to just talk about life. So I started an examination of what life was like for local African American communities, and found that things were certainly not, the examination was certainly not as simple as I thought it was going to be. We took a look at a lot of different records that we maintain here in order to get that better understanding of what our African American community was like. That included looking at local newspapers, historic materials, photographs, vital statistics, business licenses, oral histories, really anything that you could think of that might be useful to a historian that we had in our collection or we had access to online. We examined, because I really wanted to develop a deep of an understanding of what it meant to be an African American here in the 1920s as possible. Like with everything, though, as deep as we try to go, the picture is not always a complete one. There's a lot of gaps and a lot of missing material and missing understanding that leaves us with basically a series of snapshots and attempts of us to kind of read between the lines as we develop a narrative understanding. So realize that while this may seem like a very in-depth discussion, there's still a lot of things that we don't know. So hopefully we'll be able to share some information what we found, but realize that it will always be incomplete. So by the numbers, this is a good place for us to start. In terms of the population of the county in 1920, there were 20,808 people living here in Shenandoah County in the federal census, and 416 of those were African Americans. Now that's about 2%. That number had been in decline here since the 1880s. And interesting enough, that year also saw a general population decline between 1910 and 1920 here in Shenandoah County. In 1930, both those trends continue. The records are not broken down in the same way, so I had to estimate a little bit, but there are approximately 400 African Americans, so just a few fewer which is about 1.75% of the population. That number does continue to decrease after 1930, but you can tell we're not looking at a large African American population here in the county, but it is a larger percentage than our current African American population. And it's not a small number either. It is a pretty sizable number of individuals. So those 416 African Americans that lived here in 1920 were part of a changing world. They were seeing the death, the passing away of a previous generation of the individuals that had served as slaves here in Shenandoah County, or who had lived through emancipation and who'd lived through the slave system. Most of those people died during the, start to pass away in the early 1900s, and that continues. So as we get into the 1920s, most of the people who were adults during the slave period are no longer with us. And many of the people who were just children are now the senior citizens of the African American community. So that living connection with enslaved individuals is really being lost. We also see a growth in industrial jobs. Many African Americans dating back to slavery had worked on farms in the county. However, in the 1920s, we see both in Shenandoah County and in other parts of the country that industrial jobs open up a lot more to African Americans. And these communities take efforts to become part of that system and to get jobs in manufacturing plants. And that leads to the next part, a migration. African Americans in the county start to move to follow those new jobs that are now available to them. This happens inside the county. We see a lot of movement of African Americans who lived on farms now living in towns. We also see a movement of many African Americans who lived in the southern part of the county to the northern part of the county because Strasburg, with the railroad junction and other industry, had more job opportunities than places like Newmarket and Mount Jackson and even Woodstock. So we see that population shift. And we also see the beginning of a shift of the local African American population moving outside the county, following a national trend, moving into cities that have more economic opportunities for African Americans in terms of those industrial jobs. So people are moving, and that's changing the dynamics of the community. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And we also see both in the broader community, and this is reflective in the African American community, and a desire to progressively expand to make their institutions better, to offer improvement in terms of education, in terms of churches, in terms of organizations. And we'll see some of that effort, but there's this idea that things need to be better than they were. If we're going to be a community that is attractive for people to live in, that people want to be a part of, then there was a feeling both in the general community and the African American community that we needed to make our buildings newer. We needed to improve opportunities and jobs and things. And that's reflected in some of the things that we're going to talk about. But even with this growing economic opportunities and this progressive movement, African Americans are still living in a limited world. And this is limited by law, and it's limited by culture, It's limited by society. As you know, the white population makes, you know, as the white population takes efforts to continue to segregate the community, um, legally, we know that African Americans couldn't do a whole lot of things. You know, eat in certain places, use the same restrooms, ride on the same trains. Um, you know, they didn't have as political opportunities in terms of um, equal access to voting, equal access to serve on juries, equal access to legal protection. Um, we see racism, racism both codified. There's this thing called the Racial Integrity Act that comes about in Virginia during the 1920s that really starts to um, really define what it means to be a person of color versus a white person. And that there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, but we start to see, you know, really crackdowns on things about interracial marriage, you know, and then really the definition of what it means to be white and what the definition of what it means to be other, and how that works in the society. There's still economic limitations. We don't find African Americans um, serving as managers in big firms or being the boss of white people. There's certain jobs that are still off limits to them. We don't see African American lawyers in Shenandoah County. We don't see judges or, um, you know, a lot of things, not necessarily always because of legal restrictions, but in a large part because of social and cultural restrictions placed on them by the white community. So this entire system is really designed that even though we're seeing some new economic limitations, it's still within a system that really puts a cap on what they're able to do. And also social limitations. We'll talk a little bit about this, but in terms of interactions between African Americans and the white community, they're very defined, um, and they're very limited. There are things that happen, and there are things that are not allowed to happen because of a set of social norms. So you're not going to see social events where African Americans and white people are interacting in ways that aren't very defined and very limited. So we'll see some small examples of things like that happening, but you know, it's not going to be that an African American is going to go over to a part of town and, you know, go to a party with, you know, a white person. That's just something that's not going to happen because of the segregated world that Shenandoah County was living in and had created for itself. So in our examination of the African American community, it's really important to understand what voice that we are interacting with. The African American community really didn't have a way to express who they were and, you know, what they believed in the same way that the white community. There are a separate group that's defined, and that means that there some of the opportunities, things like the local newspapers and the legal records and things are written by the white community members. And so we have to understand in examining that the voice we're hearing is oftentimes what the white editors of the newspaper and the white legal system and you know, the general community is allowing to be presented. It's not always the uncensored voice of the African American community. So the voice that we get is one that really defines a separate community. The local newspapers publish columns from different areas of the county. So you'll see columns from places like, in the Woodstock paper, like Aranda and Harrisville and Edinburgh and, the rural postal routes, really defining as this is a different place. They do the same thing for African American news. There's a separate column that is called sometimes our colored folks or our colored people, colored news, that really defines them apart from that Woodstock news that's being presented. Even though they lived in Woodstock or they might live in one of these other communities, they're really defined as a separate community, even in the voice that comes through the newspaper. There's omission. There's at the time 4 published local newspapers, and we know that they omitted things about the African American community that we as researchers, or we people in the 21st century, would love to know about. There's not stories about certain events in some newspapers. So we'll see some of this later, but there may be an article in Woodstock about something that happens in Newmarket in terms of the African American community that the Newmarket paper doesn't report on, or vice versa. Or there's national news that's omitted by these newspapers. And that's done as a way to really define a narrative. I mean, each of these newspapers is trying to sell to an audience who may not be concerned about what's going on with the African American community. Or perhaps sometimes it's even as much as there may not be someone from the African American community who's able to write a column for the paper. We see in a time between ministers in Woodstock that the column disappears, probably simply because there's no one who feels comfortable or who is educated enough to write that on a daily basis. So there's a lot of omission of things in the voice that we're getting. The language in legal documents and newspapers, in most anything that we see now, unless it's produced by the African American community itself, refers to all African Americans in specific language. The use of words like colored is probably the most glaring, but we just, the tone and some of the voice that's used specifically defines what the African American community is in terms of the relation to the white community and the narrative they're trying to establish. This newspaper article on the screen here, I know it's relatively small, but this is a good example of that. So this is an article that appeared in the Shenandoah Herald, and it's talking about a reunion of employees at Liberty Furnace. So if you don't know where Liberty Furnace is, that's west of Edinburgh here. It was an iron furnace for about really 100 years. And it had closed by this time, but they had this reunion of employees, and there's between 500 and 600 people that show up. And it gives this story at the end about what they define as a strike, where the workers went on, they say strike because African Americans were hired to work there. And this was in the 1880s. And, when they use words like strike and they talk about the trouble and things, it's really in a way that defines it as, number one, the fault of the African Americans, and number two, something that would never have happened if the African American community hadn't tried to go outside of its defined place in society. We know that this wasn't a strike. We know that this was a race riot where people were attacked. But the tone of the newspaper changes all that from white employees attacking people to steal their jobs to a strike over some type of labor relations that was the fault of some African Americans. So this is a good example of how, they still report on something that happened, but the entire tone, the narrative, the language, and to a degree, there's a mission that is really redefining um, the place of the African American community. So those are all things we have to be aware of when we're looking at that voice. The one time we get really lucky that the actual African American community's voice appears is in 1923. There's a single article that we'll talk a little bit more about later that comes to light in the Strasbourg News, and it's a reprint of a column from a newspaper called the Washington Eagle. Now, the Washington Eagle was a historically Black African American newspaper that's printed in DC, and apparently there were two newspaper correspondents from that paper who lived in Strasbourg and probably sent a regular column to the Washington Eagle to be published about African Americans in Strasbourg. Now, unfortunately, that paper isn't, at least in a way that we could find it, doesn't exist. But there is a reprint of a single column in April of 1923 that is written by these African American correspondents that gives an entirely different voice to their community. And we're going to talk a lot about that because we draw a lot of information from that. But that is really was lucky that we were able to find that because it is the one time when there's an unvarnished, in theory, uncensored article that comes directly from the African American community to us as researchers in the 21st century. All right, so one of the first things I want to talk about is in terms of the limitations. We all hear stories about the emergence of the KKK in the country. Sometimes just groups called vigilantes that make efforts to, by violence, and also other avenues, enforce this segregated racial system that's developed. What we don't hear a lot about is that happening in Shenandoah County. And I think, and we know that the narrative was developed that didn't really happen here. But what we did find in the 1920s is it really did. And the 1920s is a time of rebirth for the KKK. It really comes to its strongest point in our country's history nationally, as there are KKK chapters around the country. There's huge parades, KKK parades in the nation's capital and cities and everywhere as they flex their political power. And it's not unrealistic that they would have been here in Shenandoah County. We found several instances of that. The first, there's a book called Early Woodstock that features stories from, Yesterday in Woodstock, that features stories by Fred Painter. And in it, he has this chapter where he talks about vigilantes and the KKK. And while he tries to paint it in a way that has little to do with race, all the stories happen to deal with African Americans. So it's pretty clear that the KKK took some efforts to enforce a segregated system. So he talks about the KKK chapter meeting in the Shenandoah Herald office in Woodstock. That's really the only evidence we have supporting that there was a KKK chapter in Woodstock, but that is pretty strong evidence. He also talks about one episode where there was a white woman who was in a relationship with an African American man, and a group of citizens in Woodstock attacked them at her home one night, using fire hoses and sprayed them and basically ran them out of town. So we know that actions are taken to, even by violence, to enforce this segregated system. We know that in addition to the KKK chapter in Woodstock, there's one in Strasbourg. This article here, and we'll jump ahead a little bit, but this article talks about a big regional KKK meeting at Shenandoah Caverns. At this meeting, it says there are 1,805 cars with 7,500 people, of which just over 4,200 were Klansmen or Klanswomen. And they had this huge picnic and this huge gathering. There were speakers, and it also talks about that there were delegations from the Strasbourg and Woodstock clan there. So, as an African American in the community, knowing the fact that an organization that's really established to define a system that keeps you down, is having a meeting with over 7,500 people in Shenandoah County. While there's maybe no direct threats of violence that come from this article, the reality is the implications there. You would have known that, hey, there's this huge group of Klansmen. There's a Woodstock chapter that Fred Painter talks about, meeting without their hoods on because they weren't afraid of people knowing who they were. There's a KKK chapter in Strasbourg. There's Klan parades. There's articles that appear in the newspaper. You would have known too about KKK violence elsewhere. I mean, you would have known about the Tulsa race riots and other actions. So the fact that these articles show up, the fact that there are chapters here, we don't get a lot of reports of violence. Some of that's probably the omission part of the newspapers and the legal record. But at the very fact that these chapters are present implies that violence could happen, and that there really is an established organization here to not only keep African Americans in their designated place, in the system, but a wide variety of other minorities. So just everything that we talk about, we have to remember that those limitations that we talked about earlier are being enforced by not only a legal system, but also this group and other groups that have a big presence here in the county. So as an African American working within this limited system, the most powerful tool or the most powerful part of your community would have been your church. And in the 1920s, there were 8 African American churches that existed that served their communities. So there's Mount Zion Methodist in Strasbourg, which is still in existence. There's Esby Baptist, also in Strasbourg, which is still in existence. There's Mount Zion Methodist in Woodstock, which is also still in existence. We know that there was a Baptist church in Woodstock. One reference called it Shiloh Baptist. Other times it's just the Baptist church. It's no longer in existence, but we know it had meetings in the 1920s. There's Calvary Methodist Church in Mount Jackson, First Baptist Church in Mount Jackson, Asbury Methodist Church in Newmarket, and Zion Baptist Church in Newmarket. And those last 4 are also not in existence, but some of the buildings still stand. And we have some information about that that we're always willing to share. But these 8 places were really the center of the African American communities. They're the places where meetings are held to advance those progressive agendas that we talked about. They're the places where what political power and what political positions African Americans are going to take are established in congregational groups. They're the places where education is promoted. They're really, to a degree, you know, part of the school system. They're the places where school programs and things like that happen. They're the people, the places where ministers who are leaders to the community, both in terms of spiritual leadership, but also political leadership, cultural leadership, educational leadership, where those people hold sway. So these are really the center and the focus of each of the African American communities, because they really are the one place where they have power over what's going on in their lives. They're the place where the African Americans are making their own decisions, having their own leadership, and being able to really interact with each other without really having to have this system come in that's really trying to interfere with their lives. So I don't think that can be over exaggerated, is how important these 8 places were to the African American community in the 1920s. This picture here on the screen, this is Mount Zion Methodist in Strasbourg. We don't know exactly when this picture was taken, but most likely this is what it would have looked like during the 1920s, or especially the early 1920s. So it's just a pretty simple church, but it, like I said, it is the hub of that African American community. This is the Mount Zion Methodist in Woodstock. It is one of the churches that's founded right after the Civil War. We can trace it to 1867, 1868. The original church is in the top left. It was built in 1868. And in the 1920s, there's a major shift as part of this progressive drive on behalf of the African American community. And what happens is they're able to raise enough money to build a new church. And that's constructed in 1922 on the same lot as the old church. So at the bottom right is a photograph of the new church. You can see it's written on there, founded in 1930. That's not right. This picture was probably taken soon after the church was finished as a part of a series. They took a picture of the old church and then a new one, and they made postcards out of them. So the bottom right one is a postcard that would have been used to promote the fact that the African American community was able to build this new modern church. This is the church that still stands there. And in that postcard, you see there's a picture of an oval picture of a guy. His name is W.H. Polk. He's the minister, the Methodist minister for the Woodstock, Mount Jackson, Newmarket, and Luray Church, the Methodist African American churches. And he's really the spearhead of the effort to build this church and for a lot of other improvements that happened in the African American community in the 1920s, especially in Woodstock, where he lives. And he said in a newspaper article that we, as in the African Americans, want the church to be a credit to Woodstock. So that's a reflection of this progressive spirit and progressive effort on behalf of the African American community to try to improve what they have control over, which is in terms of the church, and make it the best that they possibly can. We know that as part of the newspaper articles talking about the church's construction, on March 18th, 1921, they had 27 members, which is not a lot, but you have to consider again that there's only just over 400 African Americans in the whole county. And that were those 27 members, there definitely wouldn't have been any white members. And we get, through the effort to build this church in the newspaper, a lot of coverage of their efforts, and what's going on with the church. So we get a lot of information on things like the fundraisers that they're having, the construction of the church, information about this progressive spirit that's happening, to improve their community, and some of what the African Americans do. So it really is great information, that talks about what's going on here with African Americans, not only in Woodstock, but also as reflective in the whole county. So second to the churches in importance is going to be the African American school. Now, the school system is completely segregated. There were defined African American schools and white schools. There were four in 1920. There would have been four, as they called them, colored schools. One in Strasburg, one in Woodstock, one in Mount Jackson, and one in Newmarket. The one in Newmarket and Mount Jackson and are built in 1868. The one in Strasburg, which is on Queen Street, was built sometime before 1875, probably around 1868. And the Woodstock one is actually the last one. It wasn't constructed until 1882. Now, these are all what we would probably call elementary schools. They're just grades 1 through 7. They're just frame structures. There's a picture of the Mount Jackson one in the 1930s with a fresh coat of paint on it for an insurance report. But all of them would have probably looked relatively similar. And these four schools were each had their own teacher, who would have been an African American. In a superintendent report, they note that a white female teacher would have earned $498.98 a year. The colored female teachers at the four schools would have earned $288.94 a year. So a difference of just over $200 a year in terms of salaries. So that's a reflection of how much the school board valued the education of the African American community. Like I said, there were four colored teachers, three of which held a first grade certificate and one of it which held a second grade certificate. While remembering that, we also know that grades 1 through 7 were here. So one teacher controlling 7 grades, and their only formal training is probably either to teach first or second grade. So there's a big gap in what kind of training and what kind of opportunities are offered to the teachers of the African American community. One of the other big things that's missing is African American high school. Now, in this time period, there was the expectation that not everyone would go to high school. High school, really, to a degree, was still like how we view college. But there were white high schools in each of the county towns and even some of the rural communities. There was not one for African Americans. So any African American that wanted to attend above grade 7 would have had to go to early on in the 1920s, either Manassas or Charlottesville to go to school. And that would have been on the expense of the parents. The school board did not provide transportation. The school board did not pay their tuition. That would have all been covered by the parents. So really, anyone who's an African American who went to high school in the 1920s would have basically for 4 years moved to another community to attend school. Of note, of these 4 elementary schools, Strasburg School burned in 1929. and was replaced by the current Sunset Hill School, which was just recognized last year with its own historic marker. And in 1925, the Newmarket School actually was closed because of low enrollment. So that's a reflection of this migration of African Americans out of communities where there's not as much opportunity. We know the African American community in Newmarket was much smaller and would diminish during the decade. But what is interesting is the school is closed and there is no reporting of any efforts by anyone to keep it open. So most likely, despite any objections that would have come from any African American student who would now have to go to Mount Jackson to go to elementary school, there wasn't even any news coverage of the closing of the school apart from an auction announcement. So you can tell how important that was to the local white community. This is that picture of the church again, Mount Zion and Woodstock. And we can see in the background is actually the one picture we have of that 1882 school in Woodstock. Now, this is interesting in the fact that this was taken probably in 1920 or 21. So we can see really what the conditions of that school were. You notice there's no paint on it, unlike that picture in the 30s that was done in Mount Jackson for the insurance report. And it doesn't look like, to me, the best place that I would have wanted to go to school, especially knowing that a couple blocks away on Court Street, there was this nice brick building that was being used by the white community. We know during the 1920s, there was an attempt by the African Americans to get a new school. The school board told them that they could build a new school if they could raise enough money for it. So while taxes were paying for other schools, in conjunction with some contributions, no tax money was offered to help with that school. And the descriptions of what it was like with inadequate heat and no indoor restrooms, again, I don't think it was probably the best educational environment. And that's kind of reflective of what the system would have been like. So organizations, apart from your church and apart from your school, what might people who were African Americans in the 1920s done in Shenandoah County? We have to remember there's no TV, radio doesn't come about till partway through the decade. So any entertainment, any free time is going to be associated with an organization or some other group doing something. And this is both in the white and African American community. So organizations were much bigger part, even compared to today, of people's lives. And these are some of the ones we know that existed in Shenandoah County for African Americans. There's one of the biggest is the Hilltop Lodge of the Knights Pythias in Strasburg. And this photograph is not from the 1920s, but it is the only photograph we have of the Hilltop Lodge. It's taken in 1908, probably at the Mount Zion Methodist Church, and where they probably were meeting. And the Knights Pythias is an organization. It's a fraternal organization that was founded to help provide benefits to people who were injured at work, for families of where the breadwinner had died, and also social opportunities, networking opportunities, charity opportunities, you name it. That's what the Knights Pythias did for the African American community. We know that there was also white Knights Pythias organizations in Shenandoah County, so it was definitely segregated. But the Strasburg group was very active. We get reports from some Richmond newspapers that they would pay out insurance benefits to individuals. We know that they had meetings and would conduct dinners and fundraisers and things in Strasbourg, but also in Woodstock. They made efforts to help support the construction of the new church. They helped raise money for the school. We know they were a very active and large organization. And the reason that they're so much larger than maybe some of the other ones in the county is the existence of those economic jobs in Strasbourg in industry. And we'll talk a little bit about more of those later. We also know that there's this organization called the Shenandoah Valley Improved. It was the Shenandoah Valley Improved Benevolent and Protective Order Elks of the World. Okay, and that's a Shenandoah Valley chapter of this national organization for African Americans. We know that there was a chapter in Strasbourg. There was a presence in Newmarket and a presence in Woodstock. Most likely there was also one in Mount Jackson, but we just don't have any written record of that. Probably there was one large chapter in the 1920s for all these towns, and they just had meetings in the different communities. But it's not really clear, and it is possible that there may have at some point been separate chapters for each town. They are very similar to the Knights Pythias in the fact that they are a fraternal organization. They're raising money for charity. They're hosting events. They're hosting school plays. They're hosting fundraisers, things like that, and a chance for people to get together in a protected environment and really have fun, be together, and be a community, an African American community. There's 5 other organizations here that we found reference to that we don't really know too much about. There's the Courts, which was a group in Strasbourg, the Busy Bee Club in Woodstock, the Blue Circle, also in Woodstock. We know there was a Civic League in Woodstock. The Civic League was working to raise money for the church, working to raise money for the school, and improvement of the facilities for African Americans. We also know that there was apparently an African American baseball team in Woodstock that played as part of a circuit. There's some evidence that comes through some histories of the Valley League baseball groups that indicate this. And we found one news article where the team played Harrisonburg and lost as a fundraiser in Edinburgh. So we don't have too much else to go on in terms of that baseball team. But we do know that there was an African American team. They played other teams throughout the whole valley on a regular schedule. So there would have been regular African American baseball games somewhere in the town of Woodstock. This is just 2 pieces of information that pops up about those elk lodges, that Shenandoah Valley chapter. We see here on the left a news advertisement for what was called Elks Field Day. This apparently was held every year, starting in about 1926, and at least through 1929, where this chapter of the Elks hosted a 4th of July, initially a 4th of July celebration. You can tell here was also held later in the July for Elks chapters in Northern Virginia. So Alexandria, one came out of Arlington one time. They would come down and have this big outdoor fair. There would be a parade of these Elks groups. The Elks bands would perform. They would sell food and there would be prizes. And basically like a big fair, or you can tell they're a field day, where this local chapter is hosting this group out of Alexandria in Northern Virginia as a way to raise funds for their organization and also to just connect as a broader African American community and have a good time. This map This map comes from the 1930 update of the Sanborn fire insurance map of Strasbourg. And I know it's relatively small. It's the best we could do, but you can tell here on A Street, right here was the lodge hall for the Elks. Now, we don't know too much else about this lodge hall, except for when the Strasbourg school burned in 1929, that's where classes were held until a new school was built. But for the fact that the Elks were able to raise enough money to build their own lodge in Strasbourg, reflect of how many members and how big a part of a community that was. And that lodge hall would have not only held meetings of the Elks, but also community events, community meetings, school events, because there wasn't a school auditorium for African Americans, and really anything that would have been going on in the community. So that building on A Street, though we don't know too much about it, would certainly have been an important part of Strasbourg's African American community. So, at the beginning, we talked about economic opportunities. And one of the things I was really surprised to find is how many Black-owned businesses existed in Shenandoah County in the 1920s. I think one of the reasons that they were not identified before was because most of the owners of these businesses, when they're listed in the census record or any other legal record, most of them have other full-time jobs, and they're listed under those full-time jobs in the census record. So, for example, you'll see here, and we'll talk about this, there was a barber shop in Strasbourg run by Charles Nickens. Okay, now Charles, when he's listed in the census records, he's listed as a laborer. Okay, so he must have had another job, and the barbershop was, while he owned this barbershop and ran this barbershop, he's listed as another occupation. So that's why many of these are hard to find and don't often come to light. And we don't have very much information about some of them. But through our examination of the newspapers, especially that article we talked about for the Washington Eagle, we were able to find several of them. So we're going to talk a little bit about each one of these. So the Strasbourg Laundry on B Street. Now, the Strasbourg Laundry is very interesting. There's an article on the April 23rd, 1923 Strasbourg News that talks about its reopening under the direction of a guy named George B. Witherall. Okay. And apparently this laundry had originally been opened by what was called the Laundry Club of Strasbourg. And it was run by African Americans for African Americans as a way for them to have a place to get their laundry done. It must not have been able to stay open under the direction of this laundry club, and George Witherall and some of his partners reopen it. It doesn't appear on any maps or any phone directories, but it was a big enough event that there was a front page news article in the Strasbourg News about it. The second one we mentioned, this one was discussed in that article for the Washington Eagle. It lists Charles Ernest Nickens Sr. As the owner of it. And I'm going to hopefully figure out how to get there. Get my information about Charles Nickens up so we can talk about him. All right, we're back with Charles. So Charles, he was born in 1894. He was listed as the owner of the barbershop. He marries his wife, Susie, and they have 8 children. He's a World War I veteran. He's listed first as a laborer and then in 1930 as a hotel porter, even though we know he's running this barbershop. he was only had a 7th grade education, which is as high as you could go at the Strasbourg school. But his wife did go to high school, which is interesting. And they lived on B Street. So most likely the barbershop would have been located on B Street. The second business that we find here is the Standard Life Insurance Company. Now, the Standard Life Insurance Company is not exclusive to Strasbourg, but this George Witherall was their agent in Strasbourg. Now, George, who also ran the Strasbourg Laundry and was one of the newspaper correspondents for the Washington Eagle, but he is also listed as a porter on the railroad in 1920. So that must have been his full-time job. What's interesting about him is in 1930, he owns his own house, which is pretty common among these business owners. We know he owned a radio, and he's able to read and write. So he was a pretty educated person. The bakery. So the bakery is one of our.
I'm sorry, we're not seeing your slides.
You're not seeing my slide anymore?
No, sorry.
About that. I don't know what happened. Let's get that.
And you ignored my hand waving, tried to signal you, Zach.
I couldn't see that either, Dennis. I don't know what happened. Let's get that fixed.
When you went away to catch the picture of Mr. Nickens, I think you didn't hit share screen again.
Are we back now?
Yep, I can see them now.
Thank you very much. But we're on the wrong, so we need to back up a slide. All right. So the bakery is one of the most unique finds that we found. It is run by a lady named Georgina Bird. And apart from having what I think is a very cool name, she ran a really large business. Wait a second. I don't know if I have that right. Yes. Where she made every day 3,000 hot rolls that were delivered over a 50-mile radius as part of her bakery business. She is not listed as a bakery owner in any business license, in any census record, only in the one newspaper article. But it must have been a very successful business for that to be mentioned, and for just based on the volume of what she's producing. We know that her and her husband Thomas owned their own home. They could read and write. They also had boarders that lived with them to help them raise more money. Her husband in 1910 is listed as a cook, so it's possible that he helped with the business, though the newspaper article refers to her as the owner of the bakery. And unfortunately, she dies in 1924, about a year after that newspaper article comes out. So we haven't been able to find anything else about her, but she probably had the largest Black-owned business in Shenandoah County at the time. The next one is the midwife. The 1923 Strasbourg News article lists Annie Hall as a nurse. What we were able to do is some additional research and found that in 1920, she is listed as a maternity nurse, which would have been a midwife. It says she worked on her own account, which means she worked for herself. So she would have been running this midwife and basically a community nurse program for herself, managing it herself. And what she would have done most likely is helped deliver the community's babies, because unless it was a bad delivery, a doctor would not have come. She would have helped provide medical services to the community, because there would not have been a doctor that would have helped the African-American community that readily. So a lot of things would have had to been handled by the nurse. And she would have really been their primary healthcare provider. unless something was bad enough that would had to go to a doctor. The next person is a guy named Edward Franklin Lewis. Now, Edward Franklin Lewis ran a restaurant in Woodstock. We don't know what the restaurant was called. It's only referred to once in one of the African American columns in the Shenandoah Herald. They call it Eddie Lewis's Restaurant. But we did find that he had a business license. So we were able to confirm that he really did run a restaurant. He later goes on to run a laundry and in Edinburgh before his death in 1952. The next one is the Shenandoah Cleaning and Pressing Company. We see an advertisement here for that appeared in the 1927 Farmers Telephone Directory. That's the only directory advertisement we found for what we know is a Black-owned business. It was run by a guy named Preston Scott. Preston Scott is really involved, we know, in the church. He lives in Mount Jackson. He's involved in the Baptist church there. We know Preston later runs a food stand at the Shenandoah County Fair for African Americans. But he does own this Shenandoah Cleaning and Pressing Company, and was prominent enough that he was able to advertise it in the local telephone directory. In Newmarket, we were able to identify 2 Black-owned businesses. The first one is a laundress, which was run by a lady named Mildred Taylor. Mildred Taylor, we don't have too much information on her. We know she dies in 1928 of tuberculosis. But she apparently ran a laundry business out of her home that would have served probably the African American community, but also probably members of the white community to get their laundry done. And then finally, it would have been the Newmarket Barber Shop. Now, the Newmarket Barber Shop was owned by a guy named Thornton James Morgan. Okay. And he must have been a pretty successful barber, because he is one of the few people who is listed with their business on a legal record. He is listed as a barber on his death certificate when he died in 1928, not as a laborer or a porter like many of these other people are. He also had we know of at least 3 employees who were also barbers, one of which was his son, Irwin, but he owned and ran his own shop. Now, Thornton is born in 1844, so most likely he was one of the people who was born a slave, who's still alive and active in this period, and goes from being an enslaved man to the owner of his own business when he dies in 1928. These are 6 other interesting individuals who we've identified that were African Americans here in our community in the 1920s. And I just want to talk a little bit about that, because I always feel like it's important to mention some of the unique individuals that were here, and not just about these larger and broader institutions, but to give us an idea of what the average person, what their life might have been like, who they would have been. The first of these is a guy named Perry Theo A. Thomas. Now, Perry Theo A. Thomas is a Methodist minister. He replaces the earlier African-American minister of the Methodist Church in 1929. We don't know the name of the minister who he replaces, but he goes on to serve four Methodist churches again, Woodstock, Mount Jackson, Newmarket, and Luray. And what's interesting about him is he was born in the West Indies. He and his wife, and they come to the United States. He's naturalized as a citizen in 1914 and becomes a Methodist minister. We know he's here through at least 1930. He also is recruited to be the teacher of the Woodstock African American School. He's the one who writes the column for the newspaper. So he has a pretty prominent position in the African American community as really not only their spiritual leader, but also the educator of their children and the voice of the community through the newspaper. The next person on the list is one named Estella B. Witherall. Now, Estella is George's wife. Remember, he was the insurance owner, the laundry owner, and the newspaper reporter. Now, Estella, she becomes the teacher of what was then the Queen Street School in Strasbourg. In 1923, the article that is sent to the Washington Eagle said she had been a teacher for 8 years at that school. She's also listed on the 1930 census as the teacher, so she continued on at least through 1930 teaching the children there. She doesn't have really any formal education above grade 7. So any training and any ability that she gained to be a teacher at that school would have come through on-the-job training. The next person on our list is Nanny Roberta Morgan. Now, Nanny is from Newmarket, and she is a housewife. She's married to Thornton James Morgan, the barber. And what is interesting about Nanny is in 1920, she registers to vote. Now, Nanny, what's unique about Nanny registering to vote is if you notice last year, we celebrated the centennial of women's right to vote, which would have been in 1920. That would have been the first election that any woman in Virginia could have registered to vote. And she is one of 3 African Americans that we've identified who registered to vote in that election. So for a woman to step up in that the first time she could, that's a major challenge. For an African American woman to step up to vote adds to that. Now, we know she registered. We know she paid the poll tax. What we don't know is, did she actually vote? I'm going to guess that she probably did. One doesn't go through that much effort to not actually vote. But, I'm just kind of really impressed that we would get that she would step up, despite all of what she knew was around her, to really register and take part in our electoral system in 1920. She was born in 1864, so it's also possible she was born a slave, and she dies in 1935. Her and her husband lived on what is Water Street in Newmarket. The next person on our list is David Byrd. David he's born in 1862 and dies in 1950. So again, he was probably also born a slave. And what's unique about him is that in 1921, there's an article about a robbery at what was called French's Mill, which existed on Water Street in Woodstock. And in it, David is listed as the manager of that mill. Now, his death certificate, the census records all just list him as a laborer. But that news article written by the white editor of the newspaper listed him as a laborer. or is the manager of that mill. So he must have been able to rise to a supervisory position at that mill. And he is the one responsible for catching not only the robbery occurred, but also the two people that were involved in the robbery. So he must have had a lot of commitment to that business. Next on our list is a woman named Laura Jane Burnell Mason. So Laura, she is born in 1897 and she lives until 1968 in Woodstock on West High Street. She's a domestic laborer in someone else's house. Both her and her husband are listed as that, which meant they would have been someone's servant. We don't know whose, but Laura steps up and serves as the Sunday school superintendent of the Methodist Church in Woodstock. That would have meant she would have been responsible for the education curriculum, training and organizing and recruiting teachers, ensuring that classes are held, organizing events for the Sunday school. So that would have been a pretty prominent position in the African American community to be the Sunday school superintendent. And then our final person on our list is Mildred Taylor. Now, Mildred was the laundress in Newmarket, who we talked about. She dies of tuberculosis. But what is interesting is that she is listed as a housewife throughout any legal record. So she doesn't even show up as having any type of actual employment. But yet we found evidence that she did operate and owned a laundry business. So while the legal and the larger voice admits that, we were lucky to be able to find that she, is a Black business owner here in the county in the 1920s. Oh, we missed that. Now, this is one of the unique pictures that I love about that we were able to, oops, I don't know where that came from our African American community in the 1920s. This shows a group from the Mount Zion Methodist Church in Woodstock after a fundraiser was held for that church. We know that group had a large number of fundraisers to try to raise money to construct the church and to keep it open, keep it repaired. And we don't know which one this is, but this is a Hugh Morrison photograph that we acquired a couple of years ago that shows this group after one of those fundraisers, and most likely it would have been done as a promotion to help raise money for that group. Now, the only two people that are identified here are W.T. Polk, who we talked about earlier. He's the minister of the Methodist Church. And then Preston Scott, who we talked about, was the owner of the shoe shining and pressing place in Woodstock. And he's in the back wearing makeup and holding a tambourine. So this is him here. But that, again, those are the only two people that are identified. But this shows African Americans really being a part of their community and being active, not just in a portrait setting. So I think it's a really good representation of what would have been going on. And then everyday life. We talked about these individuals, but for the everyday African American, their lives would have also been different than those business owners and the people that we were able to identify. and people, especially people who with limited economic means, are much harder to find. But we've been able to identify some things that we know about their lives. So if you were, let's say, an everyday African American in Shenandoah County in the 1920s, you would have lived in a segregated neighborhood. Unlike some places, we haven't found any evidence of laws or municipal ordinances defining where African Americans had to live, but social and cultural expectations would have limited where they could move. And those, we know that there are neighborhoods in each town that grew up around the church and the school that were predominantly African American. Political power. If you were an everyday African American, you would have had very limited political power. We see when things have to be done through political channels that the African American community enlists the support of white business leaders and political leaders to speak on their behalf. So, for example, when things have to be done with a school in Woodstock, they enlist local lawyers to help them, and they enlist business leaders to help raise money for the church. So when that interaction has to happen in terms of political power to do really anything, there has to be this partnership between white leadership and the African American community to really get anything done. Limited economic opportunities. So we talked about that even though there's new industrial jobs and there are Black-owned businesses, there really is limited economic opportunity. One of the reasons probably those business owners are listed as having other occupations is because there was not enough economic support for them to live alone off their business. And there was also they were probably not paid enough to live alone off of their regular everyday job, because most of those jobs were manual labor jobs. They would have worked in hotels carrying luggage. They would have worked at the railroad depots carrying luggage and doing other odd jobs. They would have been farm laborers. They would have been the big jobs in Strasburg were working as laborers at lime quarries and kilns. But most of those jobs were indeed manual labor jobs, with few exceptions, that would not have paid very much and would not have afforded, even for the 1920s, the general standard of the community, a very good life. Now, for African Americans, yes, it would have been good opportunity, but it's still not at the same level as the general white community. Housing would have been a challenge. We get newspaper descriptions about things like shacks and rundown housing that African Americans are living in, especially around lime quarries and things in Strasburg, and into Stephen City, where they're being employed. They're living in these rundown housing conditions. Now, sure, there would have been adequate housing for some, but just the economic opportunities wouldn't have supported large number of African Americans owning their own home. And we know the ones that did typically had multiple jobs, had boarders living with them to make ends meet and to be able to afford their own home and to support their families. And we know poverty levels, were higher among African Americans at the time. There's not a well-defined poverty level like there is now, the federal government's definition of poverty. But we know that many African Americans were living in conditions we would definitely consider to be poverty during the 1920s. So again, the economic conditions and the everyday life might have been good for some. Many still were suffering because, in large part, because of the limitations placed on them. All right, so you remember we talked about the racial equality laws that emerged early on in the 1920s that we talked about early in the PowerPoint. The racial equality laws defined or made it illegal for a white and an African American citizen to be married. We were able to find that in January of 1929, Shenandoah County Sheriff arrested Lizzie Kopp and James Reedy for interracial marriage. Now, what happened was this couple, Lizzie, African American, and James, a white man, had gone to Hagerstown, Maryland, and gotten married. And it was legal for that to happen in Maryland. But when they came back here, they were then breaking the law because they were husband and wife of two races living together. They're arrested. It's a big deal. It's on the front page of the newspaper. They're taken to court. We do not know the final results of that because it did not appear in the local newspapers. But we do know that Lizzie and James moved. They're not in Shenandoah County in the 1930 census. We think they went to West Virginia, but we're not sure. But what is an added level of interest is that Lizzie was actually the daughter of another interracial couple who had also been charged. It didn't say when, certainly many years before, with violating interracial marriage laws and had been basically exiled from the community. They said they lived in seclusion along the Massanutten Mountain. Basically, the sheriff was afraid to go there because he had been kicked out when he had tried to arrest them several times. Their children had received no education. And that's just really evidence of what happens to a couple that breaks what the definition of what's expected of them in this system. We get Lizzie's parents and then Lizzie and James, both of which get in trouble with the law and are basically forced to give up their lives because they chose to marry someone they loved who just happened to be a different color than they were. And then, when you get to the end of your life as an African American in the 1920s, we know that this segregated system didn't end there. There were separate cemeteries for African Americans and white citizens of Shenandoah County. These are the four big ones that we know of. There's Mount Zion Cemetery in Strasburg, Riverview Cemetery in Woodstock, Mount Jackson Colored Cemetery, and of course Mount Jackson, and then Kipp Cemetery in Newmarket, which was a continuation of a slave cemetery in that community. Now, of course, we know there were others that had existed before. Probably the one we know more about is Corehaven, but we are the four that we identified people were actually buried at during the 1920s through our research. But of course, other burials I'm sure would have happened in other segregated places. All right, so that's all I have in terms of the PowerPoint. So what I'm going to do is give everybody the ability to come off of mute. And if you have any questions, either just unmute yourself and ask me or send me a chat and we'll try to get those answered. Yes, sir, Rich.
Zach, you mentioned earlier that there is a copy of this somewhere that I could send to a friend.
Yes, sir. So this is being recorded, and it's going to be on our Facebook page, on the county library Facebook page. So you can send that to them that way. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
All right. So if there are no other questions, I definitely encourage anyone who wants to know more. You can reach out to me at here at the library, or come in to do some research. We'll be happy to set you up. Oh, it looks like there might be, and definitely willing to share any additional information that we have, or to help you go kind of the next level. So thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you, Zach. Well done.
Thank you, Zach, for all the time you put into
Thank you
this.
very much.
It was
Thanks,
Of
Zach.
course.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
You too. Bye, Carla Wallen.
Goodbye, Rich Church.
Thanks, Zach. I'm sorry I came late. For somehow reason, I had it stuck in my head that it was 7:30. So I'll catch the recording for the first 30 minutes. And
That's fine. That's perfectly all right.
yeah, well, it was really, really interesting. I didn't know I didn't even know what to expect. And it just
Yeah.